All right. I want to do that. All right, so you got to be joking me. What in the world? Sorry. Let's see if it stays this time. All right, good. All right, so what I thought we could do to start is, since we're good Catholics and good Thomists, we come up with a definition. So let's talk about a definition for marriage. All right, so typically you'll see something like, someone will say about traditional marriage, and they'll say something like this. Okay, a union between a man and a woman. All right, why is that not enough? Okay, so not necessarily very specific, right? So remember definitions, we talked about this before, about how they should have both genus and species, right? The thing they belong to, like the group they belong to, and then their specific difference from the other things in that group. And so what Ryan is saying is that that's not specific enough. So union might be okay. So we see some sort of relationship, but what's the specific difference from other kinds of relationships? Anybody else want to take a shot at it?
So maybe like I could be like someone could be united with someone of the opposite sex in like pursuing, like pro-life, or they could be together in an organization, united in their, mission of or some sort like that.
Yep.
That's not marriage.
No. So part of this, right, is that the reason why, I mean, at this stage, we've kind of lost the battle against gay marriage and against redefinition of marriage is because we couldn't even define it to begin with, right? And so, and we're going to talk about why that is today. But obviously, if we can't define it, how can we stop it from being redefined? All right. So here's one of the definitions the church gives. All right, and this is in a CDF document from probably about 15 years ago regarding proposals to give legal recognition to unions between homosexual persons. It says a union between a man and a woman who by mutual personal gift, proper and exclusive to themselves, tend toward the communion of their persons. All right, is that better? Is it sufficient? Is that good enough? All right, so it has a couple things there, right? Exclusive, right? So that would eliminate part of Kevin's example, right? So, and it uses the word communion instead of union. So what's a communion? So communion would be a bonding of persons in which they, in a certain sense, make a gift of themselves to each other. All right, and so that's why it's proper and exclusive to themselves. So there's a mutuality there, and there's a fullness there because you can only give yourself fully to one person. All right. Anything else that needs to be in that definition?
Yeah, so it's lacking the absence of God being part of this union, and like that he is the purpose of this union, and well, the authentic and true purpose of this union between a man and a woman if it's their true vocation.
Okay, so it's missing what it's pointing towards, what it's a sign of, which we're going to talk about in a second when we talk about the sacrament. What about children? Do children belong in the definition of marriage?
Yes.
Why?
Because the whole point of marriage is to order it towards procreation.
Okay. You guys agree with that? Okay, so Ryan wants to duke it out with you. Said the whole point of marriage is to get the other person to heaven.
I think Connor will answer.
Naturally, it's just towards the procreation of children. Supernaturally, it's towards the sanctification of the spouses.
Okay. I think I would agree with that. Although we're going to talk about like all the nuances of that, right? So in this, though, one last question about this, because we've already made a sort of a natural, supernatural distinction. What is the role of government or state with respect to marriage? Because that first definition leads to the state deciding which unions are marriage and which aren't, right? So they are the definers of it. But what is the state's role in marriage?
I would say almost like a moderator, in, sufficing what people long for, even if
Okay,
it's disordered.
Okay, so a moderator in the sense of what you're saying is that they have certain control over what might be the civil effect of marriage, things like matters of property, inheritance, legal recognition in the sense of that, according to the state, that these two would indeed be considered one. But that role ceases at anything that's not recognition. So in other words, it's not, there's no, the state has no part in deciding what marriage is and isn't, right? Only recognizing it when it happens. Okay. All right, so let's see if we can go a little deeper, building on that sort of distinction between natural and supernatural. All right, so I'm going to use the term matrimony, not that it's different from marriage, but just in order for us to sort of quickly talk about the distinction between the sacrament of marriage, we'll call that matrimony, and then natural marriage, which we'll just call marriage, okay? And that's just a matter of, it's a sort of a distinction without a difference. It's just easier to talk about it in that way, okay? All right, so here's what the Catechism says, all right? The matrimonial covenant by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole life is by its nature ordered towards the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring. The covenant between baptized persons has been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament. All right, so marriage is an end in itself, right? It's not a means to have children, all right? And the reason why that distinction is important is because a man and a woman desire to marry each other, not looking at each other as like petri dishes or gene pools, or so in other words, we have to separate the purpose of marriage, the thing, versus the intention of people that marry, right? And so the intention is always to make a sincere gift to the other person, right? That's why I pick that person. That's why I marry this person. Marriage as an institution or as a thing has as its purpose or its end the procreation and raising of children. All right, and so that distinction is really important because it gets muddled up, and it's a little bit muddled up even here, right? Where it tries to, it says that it is by its nature ordered towards the good of the spouse and the procreation and education of offspring, right? And so we have to make that a distinction there to make sure we understand that if I'm just getting married to have children, I'm using the other person, right? But if I'm marrying that person, the purpose of us getting married is to have children, okay? So, and that distinction is important, right? What were you gonna ask?
Well, so just, because it's all in the say, you could say in the sense of like, it's ended, it may not end, might be too strong word, like, so it's ordered to, could you also, I mean, in a sense, like, this might be not a good example, like an eye or something, like take some other object, like having that object is good, and that object, the eye has been ordered to see. I guess eye is not a perfect example because you would totally fine to use an eye or something like that, but there's the thing itself is good, and then it is also ordered to something else that is also
Yes.
good.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but the reason why, again, we have to make this important, right? So when we say the end of something, we can mean that in different ways, right? There's sort of 4 causes for things, right? That we talk about having ends towards things. So just think in terms of the church has kind of moved away from that language, even though it's not a change in any way, but just a change in emphasis. Just think about that marriage is the natural place in which children are brought into the world. All right, and we're going to see examples of that. And so, or we could think of it as a natural consequence of getting married is having children. All right, it's the effect of marriage. It's the effect of the full giving of self to another person. And then the reason why we have to sort of grasp the nature of marriage is because if we're going to talk about abuses of marriage, like things like contraception, then we have to understand what the natural end of marriage is, right? And so that anything that would keep it from reaching that end on our part would be wrong. Yes, Connor.
Well, that's always been one, because you kind of touched on that again, like as, especially those who have like, or in like the supernatural marriage, I guess, but even those in kind of the natural, even in the natural marriage, they should see it as part of their vocation, like their purpose in life, on a natural level, like, to have children. Like that's kind of what they.
Well, that's, yeah, exactly. I mean, that is
Yeah,
what their acts are ordered to, right?
Yeah.
Always ordered to that. And in that regard, there's no distinction. Like contraception, which I think we've talked about it before, is wrong not because the church says so, but because it does harm to the natural good of marriage, right? All right, so what is the distinction then between natural and sacramental marriage? All right, so sacramental marriage occurs only between two validly baptized Christians of the opposite sex who have no canonical impediments. We'll talk about all those in a second. So as a natural reality, marriage is ordered to sort of the perpetuating the species, right? Like as a natural, like bringing up the next generation. But as a supernatural one, remember we drew those parallels, right? It's ordered towards perpetuating the church, right? And that's why it's raised to the level of sacrament. And that's why the domestic church, sort of like the family is the foundation of society, the domestic church is the foundation of the church in a certain sense, in a parallel way, right? And so marriage, and this is brought out, John Paul II talks a lot about this, as marriage as this primordial sacrament, sort of small letter S sacrament, in the sense that that regardless of whether we sort of look at it as a sacrament, it's still a very holy thing, right? Because there's one place on this earth where God naturally acts, and that's in the womb of a woman, right? Like goes and infuses a soul into the child that's been created, right? And so, in a certain sense, marriage is a mystery, and also still a sign, and again, a natural sign of the relationship between Christ and the church, right? So even a natural, right? So even when we talk about, so the sacrament actually brings that about, right? Like for the reason I just said, right? The sacrament of marriage brings about the union between Christ and the church because it actually perpetuates the church, right? It's fruitful. The domestic church perpetuates the church. And then as a sacrament, obviously, it's a cause and a source of grace for the spouses, all right? But what we need to make sure we don't see is that somehow the sacrament of marriage is this like add-on to natural marriage. They're two fundamentally, like, they're different things, right? So they're analogous, but they're different. And so it's not like all of a sudden God took like natural marriage and added a sacrament on top of it, right? And so there's an invisible reality that the couple lives out that they have to make visible to the world. Yes.
So it's not a case of grace built on nature.
No. So it's well, yeah. So I think we may have talked about this before. Grace built on nature. Grace perfects nature, right? Big difference, right? And so, in a certain sense, yes, like the sacrament perfects the natural institution of marriage, right? But it's not a sense of like this is a natural marriage plus grace. It's like it's a supernatural reality, first and foremost. All right. Yes. Yeah. Do we know when the first sacramental marriage happened?
Does it need to be baptized, or they just need to have sanctified grace?
Well, yeah, but we wouldn't know, right? Like in the Old Testament, we wouldn't know like if the person had.
I guess I was referring to.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, in a certain sense, like, well, and we're going to talk about this, like Saint Joseph and Our Lady, like they had the perfect marriage, right? And we'll talk about why that is in a second. But yeah, I don't know. Like it wasn't necessarily instituted at the wedding of Cana, but clearly by, when St. Paul talks about it in Ephesians, it's a sacrament, and because he calls it that, like it's one of the few places that he uses that term, right? And which we'll talk about in a second. So I don't know who the first like couple ever to have a sacramental marriage was. Yes.
So natural marriage, so by using that word, like there's I guess, an implication that people can just do marriage naturally. Any man, any woman who has no impediments that would be canonical, impediments, could just validly. So what's the minimum point of that? Because this kind of goes back to my question of like how what is required for someone to be able to naturally contract a marriage?
Just consent, right? Just consent. And obviously then, no impediments to that consent, but just consent.
But I guess how good of an idea of marriage? I guess so in Maoist, we've seen different cultures have different ideas of what marriage is.
Sort of like that's how you can tell it's part of the natural law, right? Yeah. Like because by nature, there may be distinctions in cultures about like, and this is why it's important to talk about this, because marriage is not like a man-made institution, right? Which is what a lot of people say, right? And because if it was, then we could change it however we wanted to, right? It's natural. It's a natural institution. So, a natural marriage on the surface will look very similar to a sacramental marriage.
Polygamy, for example, we see a lot of times in the Old Testament that was a common practice. So obviously, I guess after the first one, this would not have been valid. I'm not sure you could call it marriage then.
Yeah, I mean, so like from a biblical perspective, polygamy is something just like divorce that God allows, right? But in the beginning, it was not so, right? Sure. I'm sorry. I will repeat the question so that moving forward, I will repeat it. All right. All right. So I think we talked about the next slide. In our own time, in a world often alien and even hostile to faith, believing families are of primary importance as centers of living, radiant faith. For this reason, the Second Vatican Council uses an ancient expression, calls the family the domestic church. It is in the bosom of the family that parents are, by word and example, the first heralds of the faith with regard to their children. They should encourage them in the vocation which is proper to each child, fostering with special care any religious vocation. All right. And we're going to come back to that. All right, so let's get some key terms defined. So a valid Catholic marriage results from 4 elements. All right, the spouses are free to marry. They freely exchange their consent. In consenting to marry, they have the intention to marry for life, to be faithful to one another and be open to children. And their consent is given in the presence of 2 witnesses and before a properly authorized church minister. Okay. I think these are all pretty straightforward. I don't know that I really want to go into them deeply. Okay, so what about marriages in which there is either a Catholic and another Christian who is not Catholic, or between a Catholic and an unbaptized person? All right, so that the first one would be what we call a mixed marriage, and then the second one would be disparity of cult. All right, so according to the law enforced in the Latin Church, a mixed marriage needs for licity the express permission of ecclesiastical authority. In the case of disparity of cult, an express dispensation from this impediment is required for the validity of marriage. This permission or dispensation presupposes that both parties know and do not exclude the essential ends and properties of marriage and the obligations assumed by the Catholic party concerning the baptism and education of the children in the Catholic Church. All right, so one of the things that for Catholics, one of the things they agree is that they'll bring their children up in the faith, regardless if the other spouse is Catholic or not, a believer or not, and so forth. Yes.
When did this become? Because I mean, obviously now this is pretty common, or at least it's pretty widely. Like I highly doubt anyone has any difficulty getting the permission or dispensation required for it. When did this become like a pretty? Is this one of those cases of the exception becoming the rule, or?
Yeah, where it wasn't like where it was now it's just a formal like
No, I mean,
a formalized, like barely
like-
formal.
Yeah, I mean,
I would say like okay, so I'm going to admit my bias. Like if one of my kids were going to marry someone that was not Catholic, I would tell them not to, like, honestly, because it ends up. I mean, there's a couple of issues with it, right? The first is that it ends up you hiding your faith because you don't want to insult your spouse. But it also, in a certain sense, really sends a really confusing message to kids, right? Of like, okay, my parents don't even agree on that. Like, they don't agree on this. This thing must not be that important, right? And so a lot of priests will counsel couples not to try to convert each other. Like, I think that's a bad idea. I think you should try to convert. Like, if you are living in the truth and you love your spouse, why wouldn't you try to convert them? But I think that sort of attitude probably flows out of kind of just like the false ecumenism that has a, you know, as opposed to like a true ecumenism where you're trying to find levels of agreement with the person and then from those levels of agreement converting them. So I mean, it probably in the past 50 to 100 years is a way bigger issue than it used to be, and that's some of that is just because, you know, in the past it was, you know, entire countries were Catholic. You couldn't necessarily, like, Catholics and Protestants were separated and so forth. So I think that's part of it. But either way, the Catholic person in the marriage always agrees that they will baptize the child and raise them Catholic. All right. All right. So when was it instituted? On the threshold of his public life, Jesus performed his first sign at his mother's request during a wedding feast. The church attaches great importance to Jesus' presence at the wedding of Cana. She sees in it the confirmation of the goodness of marriage and the proclamation that thenceforth marriage will be an efficacious sign of Christ's presence. All right. Notice that it doesn't say that he instituted the sacrament there. All right. And so, like some of the other sacraments, like confirmation as an example, we don't know exactly when he instituted it. We just know that it was instituted by Christ because St. Paul says so. Okay. Be subordinate to one another out of reverence for Christ. I'm going to read this because for some reason it gets cut out whenever it's time to read it in the Mass. Be subordinate to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives should be subordinate to their husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is head of the wife, just as Christ is head of the church, he himself the Savior of the body. As the church is subordinate to Christ, so wives should be subordinate to their husbands in everything. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak in reference to Christ and the church. So this great mystery, the Greek word mysterion is also the same word, Latin word sacramentum, which we get sacrament from. So first of all, just to kind of deal with the elephant in the room, like what is it that people don't like about this particular reading? Yeah, so Connor said it's so stuck in the past. Yeah, so of course, anytime you talk about authority and subordination and all of that, right? So this to me is like, as a guy, is totally like, well, it's a little bit daunting, but it's completely and totally good news, right? Because what St. Paul is really saying, what's the first effect of the fall? Like they lose sanctifying grace, but then what are the curses that are attached to their fall? Yep. So labor and labor, right? Yeah. Yeah. So there's this strife between the two, right? Because the relationship gets all out of whack, right? So the husband, as head of the wife, no longer knows what it means to be head of the wife, right? He lords it over her, right? But what St. Paul is saying here is that Christ undoes all the effects of the fall. And so he restores marriage back to its original. That's why he says in the beginning it was not so. So what is he doing? He's healing us through the sacrament, so it's medicinal, to be like Adam was supposed to be from the beginning, right? Willing to lay down his life for his bride, which we kind of talked about last week when we talked about priesthood. So so the whole point then, this is good news. Like we should be proclaiming this, because especially now, marriage is a mess, right? And it's a mess because, you know, like your story last week about somebody saying, well, it's just the ideal, right? Well, Christ, when he gives an ideal, empowers us to do that thing, right? Like that is, because otherwise marriage would be really, really almost impossible, right? And that's profoundly good news, right? And so why not shout it from the housetops, right? We're worried about subordination. Like, what woman wouldn't want to be wooed by Christ? Like, I mean, we're Christian, right? Like, what woman wouldn't want to have Christ over her, laying his life down for her? And then he's going to make the husband be like that. Like, that's supremely, like, that's at the heart of the good news, right? And so that, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's a shame, because we lose the supernatural gifts that Christ is giving to us, and people enter into the sacrament thinking it's just an ideal thing rather than a sacrament that actually will transform me and make me be able to do that. All right. Okay. So just the sacrament itself, right? So this particular passage shows, okay, there's a sacrament there. It's been there from the beginning. And so the Council of Trent says that the sacrament is based on three different pieces, right? The external sign, and that external sign is a symbol of the union of Christ with his church. And then, like all sacraments, it has an internal grace. And we just talked about what that internal grace is. It sanctifies. And then the third thing is that it's instituted by Christ. And it could only be so. It can only be a great mystery. It can only be a source of grace if Christ himself instituted it. Okay. And so while, remember, sacraments not only are signs, right? So natural marriage is a sign of the union with Christ and his church, but sacraments actually bring about the thing they signify, right? And so it makes the man into that. It makes the wife into, like, it purifies her, right? And makes her holy, just like Christ does in the church. Yes.
So this is kind of saying, talking about the sacramental marriage and the fact that it has these three elements, just to make sure I understand from the beginning. So it's not like when you get married sacramentally, you have a natural marriage and a sacramental marriage. It's kind of, they coexist. So like you either have a natural marriage or a sacramental marriage. So when let's just say two atheists get married and they both have a conversion. I mean, I think this happened. Two atheists get married, they have a conversion, and then they go, okay, we want to be married. Are they technically being remarried? Is their marriage?
Yeah. So the question is, if two atheists get married, and then later on have a conversion, like, so that would be a case of like where they would go before the church and convalidate their marriage. So in other words, the church would then say that a valid marriage is taking part, and then the sacrament, and institute the sacrament at the same time.
Okay, so it wouldn't, I guess, does their old marriage destroy? Does it transform?
No, they were still validly married. I mean, it wasn't, but in a certain sense, when you have a sacramental marriage, it also is a natural marriage, right? Like, in a certain sense, right? Like, the reality is the same, right? That's why the making present the invisible grace is really important. Like, someone should look at my family and go, or look at my marriage and go, oh, that's a Christian marriage because of the way they love each other, right? But in a certain respect, it's still like a natural, like, it's just an elevation, right? I want to keep them separate, but not to the point that they're totally different. So, I mean, you're still like on the level of analogy, right? Where there are similarities to them, between them, and an overlap. All right, I think, all right, so what are the matter and form? I take you for my lawful husband or wife directly signify and affect the marital union with indirectly signifying and affect sanctifying grace. So the consent is the expression of consent is the form, and then the matter is also that. So the matter and form is the same thing. Okay, because they signify the mutual surrender of their bodies to each other, which that's the matter, right? The giving of one to the other, right? And that point about understanding that when you get married, you surrender your body to your spouse. Like that's a totally like foreign idea to us, right? And it's one of the reasons why things like surrogacy is wrong, right? Because a man has a right to the child born of his wife's womb, right? And has a right to be the father of that child, right? And so then the acceptance of it then is the form, okay? And then the effects are sanctifying grace, and then sacramental graces, which you can't necessarily enumerate and list, but they're essentially all the grace you need to live out your vocation, right? So on, at the moment of the exchange of vows, God, in a certain sense, gives all of the actual graces that the couple will need throughout their marriage for whatever they face. Okay.
Are those graces like distributed at a time, or like, I guess like you're able to receive them at that moment, but
I mean, yeah. So how it works is a little bit I don't want to say mysterious, but in the sense of like the what it does is I think it's a pledge. The best way to look at it is it's a pledge on God's part to supply you with the actual grace in the moment that you need it, right? And so that when something suppose a couple has some tragedy that they have to deal with or something, they can depend on the grace to get through that, right? God has pledged it to them. Yes.
So you get sanctifying grace. Let's just say Catholic and an atheist get married. Does the atheist get sanctifying grace from that?
No. The Catholic would, because they've received the sacrament, but again, is it something like where the graces end up bound and then released if they were to be baptized? I mean, I would say probably, but I don't think the church has a definitive teaching on that. Okay, then the ministers, which we've talked about many times, are the couples themselves, and the priest is just the witness. The priest or deacon is just a witness. And then, all right, so let's talk now about marriage itself. All right, so that's all the preliminary stuff related to the sacrament of marriage. And let's talk about its effects, and then talk about concretely what it does. All right, so in the Catechism, it talks about marriage under the regime of sin. And we already touched on this a little bit about Christ's power to undo all the effects of the fall. Their union, the spouses, has always been threatened by the man and woman, has always been threatened by discord, a spirit of domination, infidelity, jealousy, and conflicts that can escalate into hatred and separation. This disorder can manifest itself more or less acutely and can be more or less overcome according to the circumstances of culture, errors, and individuals, but it does seem to have a universal character, right? So just talking about how in the fallen world, how men and women, rather than seeing themselves as seeing that natural complementarity, see themselves as competitive in some way, right? Their relations were distorted by mutual recriminations, right? So think about that for a second. Think about in the midst of the fall, they both accuse each other of something, right? And Adam indirectly kind of blames God that, the woman you put here made me eat it. And she sort of pleads ignorance as if Adam didn't tell her. Their mutual attraction, the Creator's own gift, change into a relationship of domination and lust, and the beautiful vocation of man and woman to be fruitful, multiply and subdue the earth, was burdened by the pain of childbirth and the toil of work, right? So those are the curses we already talked about. All right, so what about the effect of marriage then on that? From a valid marriage arises a bond between the spouses, which by its very nature is perpetual and exclusive. Furthermore, in a Christian marriage, the spouses are strengthened and, as it were, consecrated for the duties and the dignity of their state by a special sacrament. All right, so this is what we're going to spend the rest of the time first unpacking. All right, so the power of the sacrament, right? So I said it increases sanctifying grace and gives us all the sacramental graces we'll need, or the actual graces we'll need to live out the vocation. It can seem difficult, even impossible, to bind oneself for life to another human being. That can be like that statement right there can't be like just passed over, right? Like on a natural level, especially when virtue is lacking in a culture as a whole, it is difficult, maybe even impossible, to live out marriage. Okay, this makes it all the more important to proclaim the good news that God loves us with a definitive and irrevocable love, that married couples share in this love, and that it supports and sustains them, and that by their own faithfulness, they can be witnesses to God's faithful love. Spouses who, with God's grace, give this witness, often in a very difficult conditions, deserve the gratitude and support of the ecclesial community. All right, so what does that mean? In essence, a couple, especially Catholic couples, need to be beacons of marriage, right? Like their marriage needs to stand out as witnesses to God's faithful love. Okay. And when the spirit of the world begins to infect even sacramental marriages, then we're in trouble. Right? And that's what we have to sort of work against. Yes, Connor?
Can you talk at any point about more sensitivity?
No. That's like, no. I won't even repeat the question.
Okay, you don't need to ask questions about it.
You can ask questions. I mean, I'll give you my opinion, but.
Okay, I'll see if there's a better.
Okay. All right. I mean, I don't mind talking about different, like sort of the state of the church with respect to marriage. But what I want to make sure is that that you guys walk away from this knowing like how beautiful and sanctifying marriage is, and something you would never want to give up on, or never want to like give up in the sense of like give up on the fact that like Christ has done something amazing, right? All right, so let's get into the weeds a little bit. All right. So St. Paul says this: indeed, I wish everyone to be as I am, but each has a particular gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. All right, so he's talking about vocations. Now to the unmarried, to the widows, I say, it is a good thing for them to remain as they are, as I do. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to be on fire. All right. What is he saying here? Why is it better for someone who can't exercise self-control to get married? Like, is he setting somebody up for a really like, so the question is marriage the place where it's okay to indulge lusts? Yes.
No, it's not the place where it's okay to indulge in lust. But in a sense, like if you're marrying someone, then you're saying accountability partner isn't necessarily the best term, but like basically I have to give myself to you. Like I have to hold myself to a certain standard for this other person. And it kind of like forces you to do that.
Okay. So yeah, so forces in the sense of how?
Not forces, but kind of obligates. Like if you say I love you, you don't want to let the person down.
Okay, so what Ryan is saying is, in essence, like if you love someone, you won't use them, right, to indulge your lusts. But go back to what I said, like right before this slide, about what marriage does to us, right? So what is St. Paul actually saying there? Is that it's better for them to marry because why?
Well, they receive the graces in the sacrament, and so those graces can be purification for that marriage and those issues of self-control.
Yes, so it's a remedy against concupiscence, right? It's not a place where you just go indulge your lust, but it's actually healed, right? That tendency to want to use the other person through the sacrament of marriage is actually healed, right? Because why? Well, because the man is being sacramentally conformed to Christ, right? And in what way? Well, Christ in the way that he gives himself to the church, right? And the woman likewise, right? Receiving Christ in a pure way, right? With the purity of the church. And so, of course, St. Paul would say that because if the person can't exhibit self-control, then the sacrament of marriage, the grace, will enable them to do that. All right. And that is so important for us to understand, because if it was the place where you were okay to indulge your lust, what always happens when we indulge ourselves in anything? It just gets worse, right? And so why would you do that, right? And so grace cuts that off. Yes, Aaron.
Why does sometimes like in the New Testament and like Aquinas, Augustine, they always are writing about marriage is like, oh, if you have to do it, not like in a positive aspect as they do kind of now.
Yeah, I think some of that is not necessarily. So Aaron's question is, why does marriage seem like a second-rate vocation, especially in some of the scholastics and the church fathers? I think some of it with Aquinas, at least, is he died while he was writing his in the Summa, his stuff on marriage, so he wasn't done. But I think some of it is that from their sense, from where they're coming, some of it is just perspective, right? Like Aquinas is a cleric who basically like was given grace against lust, like, and so that's his perspective, right? Like he's and then Augustine, same thing, right? Like he's given the singular grace against lust, where he reads something and all of a sudden God heals him of it. Yeah, it's I think there's a tendency to think that the higher is always the better, right? And in one regard, it is the better because it's the higher, but not in the sense of like it's better to do what God made you to do, right? Like, and for those who can, like Christ says, like for those who can bear it, they should, but not everyone can bear it, right? And I think that it's just that. And then the other part of it is like we need a good discussion on the theology of marriage. It's still the church still hasn't done that. I mean, John Paul II got it going with theology of the body, but theology of the body is not exactly accessible, right? And it's really difficult for people to understand and to read. And hopefully someone will come along, like some new doctor of the church, that will actually, really dive into a theology of marriage. But that's part of the reason too. It's just not understood, right? It's a great mystery. Yes.
Follow up. I think some saints said like religious life is like the elevator to heaven, and marriage is like you're driving through like the Rockies mountains, like up and down. If that's the case, like it's so much easier to get to heaven in a sense in religious life. Why are the majority of people not called to religious life?
Well, so I think the flip of that. So the question is like, if it's easier to get to heaven through religious life, why? Easier maybe, but which saints are ending up higher, right? Like the highest saint in heaven, the two highest saints in heaven, married, right? Like that's got to tell you something, right? Like harder, like more conformed to the cross, more merit, right? So that's why it's not a second, like that's why we can't look at it as a second hand vocation. Yes, Michael. Yeah, so Michael brought up that one of the saints had a vision of Jesus, and he said that, and they asked for the biggest cross, and he said, no, that's reserved for people that are married. I mean, it becomes a question of perhaps it's easier to get to heaven, but what about like higher in heaven? What about closer to God, right? And certainly, again, like you live out your vocation, whatever it is, like you're going to be sanctified and you're going to be satisfied where you are. but you could easily see how married couples would have a much tougher road to hoe, right? Like than a cleric would. Yes.
And this is true in more than just like matters of the sixth and ninth commandment, but obviously perfect abstinence is a lot easier than perfect moderation. And so you're not even just things like obedience like makes life way easier. You just okay, what do I do? Whatever my superior tells me.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's it. Like, so what Connor just said was basically that abstinence is way easier than moderation, right? And that is a non-trivial point, right? And in a certain respect, married couples are perfected more in that regard, right? Because they, rather than abstaining from something or having a vow of obedience, like they have to live in the world, right? And are more dependent upon grace. But either way, like I don't want to like spend a whole lot of time of like, okay, this is higher, this is better, this is, because they're complementary, right? And one shows the other, right? Like one reveals the truth of the other. And so that part is really, really important. Yes, Ryan.
As a sort of like part of like for religious life, religion, I have like a full discussion about this. So like for religious life, you're living out more accurately kind of how we would be living in heaven. But with marriage, like that total gift of self is huge as far as love and understanding God. And so in marriage, you're very actively day-to-day living that out, and it like takes from you and requires you to give in a way that religious life doesn't.
Yeah. So Ryan is saying that in essence, the sign that is the celibate life is sort of the weddedness to God, like our final destiny. But and this is me sort of adding on to what you're saying, right? The communion of saints is really about two things, right? It's about each of our relationship with God, but it's also our relationship with another person and God, like as a threesome, right? And so the married life actually lives out the communion of saints, the imaging of the communion of saints, because you are yoked to this other person and together are yoked to God, right? And so both signs are necessary, right? Total gift of self, which is what Ryan just was talking about. By its very nature, conjugal love requires the inviolable fidelity of the spouses. Hang on one second, there's a question. Okay. All right, so the question, based on the reading from St. Paul, so it sounds like you're saying the sacramental marriage will immediately allow a couple to live out their vocation like Christ loves the church, but it still doesn't seem like that's the case, at least not perfectly nor immediately. I think we probably all know couples who have gotten civil divorces. Even for Catholic couples, that good marriages don't do that perfectly, which makes it seem more like an ideal that we should be striving for and not something that the sacrament immediately creates. Can you clarify what you mean by marriage as perfected by Christ is not an ideal? Yes, that's an excellent question. So sacraments, like all things, or all the sacraments, right? It depends upon not just the objective reality of the sacrament, but also our subjective disposition to receive that, right? And so at every moment, you have to, married couples have to practice fidelity to grace, right? So they have to constantly be seeking the grace, the actual graces that are attached to the sacrament, and then being responsive to them. And so in a certain respect, that leaves couples who aren't aware of that, or for whatever reason, difficulty, don't necessarily, they give up on it, they get a civil divorce, whatever. And I mean, that's a reality. But had they known from the beginning that divorce wasn't an option and that God would always equip them, that changes everything, right? And so in a certain respect, yes, it's the ideal, but it's an ideal that's reachable through grace. Yes.
Yeah, so this goes back to my more DTA question. So I mean, it's pretty obvious, and this idea of the ideal being unlivable or impossible, or it sounds really nice, but it's just not actually able to do, applies to kind has conception, especially, and I think it applies to a lot of things related to either marriage or sexuality. That just people say it's a nice idea, it sounds really cool, but it's just not. It's just not able to really be actualized. And this kind of comes to, I think there's a part of the Lord's CC where it speaks to this almost saying when I think it's probably talking about. I'm not sure. I don't think it's directly talking about like communion for those who are divorced or remarried or just. I guess living in a regular family situation or something like that. But getting to where it says, okay, a couple's divorced or remarried, they have kids now with this other person, and kind of saying, okay, what's the moral thing for them to do? Do they have to leave this person? Do they have to leave this brother and sister? So why is there this? Because I mean, the what's it called? The criteria that are given for what requires, it's like, you can know, let's say, the guy's living with his girlfriend, and they can know that it's against the rule, but they don't really understand why the rule's good. They think that, that he would sin more, or, one of them would sin more if they stopped doing this, and therefore it's okay. Like, what prompted, or just your comments, like, what prompted this move towards, like, this, obviously, like Nicole said, none of us are perfect, and so we're going to always kind of fall short of that true image of Christ in the church. But there's now moved towards like, well, you can really, that's not only is that this is an ideal, like marital fidelity is not, it's not marital fidelity, not even as an ideal, but just like as an unreachable ideal, and therefore the minimum standard is really a lot lower than just, you don't really have to be faithful to your spouse. That's an ideal. No expectation actually of that.
Yeah. So the question is why this sort of perpetual lowering of the bar, right? Like why this almost encouragement to embrace our brokenness, right? And well, I mean, it's a lack of faith, right? Again, it goes back to what I said from the very beginning, right? Like if I really believe that, I am Magdalene and Christ can transform me, well, that's an act of faith, right? And I will not be disappointed. So it is a lack of faith, and not just a lack of faith on the part of the couple, but the people who are encouraging them to do that too, right? Who are, and ultimately what it comes down to, and this is why it's an unbelievable lack of faith. It's what breaks my heart about that is that they're robbing the cross of its power, right? Like the cross can change everything, right? I mean, everything. Christ transforms everything, right? If we just let it. And the church's role is to get people to the foot of the cross, right? And the foot of the cross might look like, for that couple living in an irregular situation, take them to the foot of the cross where they're living as brother and sister. Really hard to do, right? But there's grace there, right? There's grace there rather than coping mechanisms or coping skills. So it's the perennial thing, coping versus the cross. Like you want the cross, only the cross heals. Coping just is a Band-Aid. And that's really what it comes down to, right? And when the church begins to offer coping mechanisms, we're in trouble, right? Because that doesn't, there's no conversion there. No conversion happens at the cross, right? And that's just the reality. All right, let's talk a little bit about the essential elements of marriage. All right, unity, indissolubility, and openness to fertility are essential to marriage. Polygamy is incompatible with the unity of marriage. Divorce separates what God has joined together. The refusal of fertility turns married life away from its supreme gift, the child. All right, so let's unpack each one of these, and then we're going to give some examples and then how it's supposed to be lived out. So unity, all right, so unity consists in having one wife. And so one wife, one husband. So some Pharisees approached Jesus and tested him, saying, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause, whatever? He said in reply, have you not read that from the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So there are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, no human being must separate. And they said to him, then why did Moses command that the man give the woman a bill of divorce and dismiss her? He said to them, because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. but from the beginning it was not so. I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, unless the marriage is unlawful, and marries another, commits adultery. All right, so we'll talk about the so-called exception in a minute. But what is Jesus essentially saying, right? He's saying, okay, the only reason why God allowed divorce was because of the hardness of heart, right? What does that mean? Why does he say that? Why is it hardness of heart? Right? Well, because the men very often would kill their wives rather than divorce them, right? That was a reality. Right? They put them away permanently, right? And so God, allowing the lesser evil to occur, allowed divorce. Yes.
So did Moses sin in doing that?
No, because no, I think actually that's one of the questions St. Thomas has in the Summa about. The question was, did Moses sin in allowing to do that? No, it was a concession, right? And there's other concessions in there, right? I mean, polygamy again is like another concession, right? So yeah. So the unity of marriage then, the fact that the couple becomes one flesh is a real thing, right? Like it's almost like the purpose of marriage, right? Of which the marital embrace is the sign of it, right? And so that part, again, we don't necessarily grasp, right? And if we don't grasp it, then we end up in a culture of divorce, which we're going to talk about in a second. Well, let's go to the ideal first, and then we'll work back to where we are now. So Mary and Joseph, did they have a valid marriage? Okay, valid marriage that wasn't consummated, right? So we can talk about, when we talk about indissolubility, we'll talk about that. Okay, so here's what John Paul II says in one of his general audiences. He says, precisely in view of their contribution to the mystery of the incarnation of the Word, Joseph and Mary received the grace of living both the charism of virginity and the gift of marriage. Which, by the way, this is the Pope saying that Saint Joseph was a virgin, by the way. Mary and Joseph's communion of virginal love, although a special case linked with the concrete realization of the mystery of the incarnation, was nevertheless a true marriage. All right, so Mary and Joseph, I think we've talked about this before, about one of my pet peeves, and it happens every Advent, is when somebody says that Mary was a single mother, and Gabriel came and like she had to suffer the stigma of being a single mother, and Saint Joseph wasn't married to her, but yet was going to divorce her, and so forth. But when we look at the marriage of Mary and Joseph, right, it's the ideal because they were so united, their hearts were like, unity is meant to unite first and foremost a couple's hearts, right? And so although they never consummated the marriage, their marriage was still fruitful, right? They still had a child, right? Because God gives our Lord to Mary and Joseph both, not just to Mary, right? It's given because where is the natural place where children are born? In a marriage, right? In a marriage, right? So God in this marriage, right? And Saint Joseph, in a certain sense, had to consent to it because he had a right to his wife's womb, right? And so the child that came out of there, he treated as his child, right? This miraculous intervention. But yet, it's because, and this is what John Paul II is getting at, it was because they were so holy and so united and so in love with each other that their marriage, despite being virginal, bore fruit, right? Think about that for a second, right? Like they were so holy that they still had a child without ever consummating their marriage. And that, like, to keep that in mind of what, and this is why, like, I'm so glad that this is the year of St. Joseph, because he's sort of getting elevated above like the also ran status, right? Like that is a family that we should all be emulating and asking for help, right? And if we treat it as if, St. Joseph is this old man, or that he has other children from a previous wife that died, or that Mary is a single mom, we miss like the grace of the Holy Family. Like, because Jesus lived out family life to sanctify our family lives, right? He spends 30 years of his, 30 years, 10/11ths of his total life on earth in a family, hidden away, right? And so what did he do? Well, that's the way most of us live, right? And so he sanctified every element of family life, right? And that's a fruitful family and a fruitful marriage, right? When that happens. Yes.
So I've heard this argument recently that a Josephite marriage has no place outside of the Holy Family. Do you agree?
Yeah, so the question is about a Josephite marriage. I don't necessarily understand the point of it. I don't know that I would go so far as to say it has no place outside of the Holy Family. But I don't know why. I don't necessarily understand why someone would contract a marriage in that situation. I think it's Saint Teresa's parents, I think, initially had that sort of intention, and God quickly turned them in the other direction. But I can't necessarily grasp the logic of it. I'm sure that I can't say it would be wrong, and could there be situations where God would call a couple to do that? Probably, but I would assume they would be few and far between, and I don't know that I would grasp the decision to do that. But yeah, I don't think it's wrong. I just think it would be extremely rare, if ever. All right. All right. So what's indissolubility? Indissolubility means that a sacramental consummated marriage cannot be dissolved with a right to remarry. Yes.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. So marriage in and of itself is by nature indissoluble. Okay. And so what God has brought together, no man can draw apart. Now, canonically, if a marriage is not consummated, then the marriage can be dissolved, but only by the Pope. Again, not really sure when that would come up. But in essence, because God brought them together, no earthly power can annul them, that. And so marriage between two baptized people is always intrinsically indissoluble. And then once it's been consummated, that's the word, consummated, it's extrinsically indissoluble too. Yes.
So is there a good way to, because I've had conversations with different people about this, and I find it is there a good way to argue, because obviously from a Catholic perspective, you can bring up, Christ's teaching. But I've talked with Protestants, I've talked with people who wouldn't accept Catholic scripture, or maybe just don't. So I guess it is actually Protestant scripture too, but they don't accept it. Just that. So is there a way to argue this from like a because I guess most people would say like that is just, in addition to the whole thing, it's like you're being so legalistic. That's just not reasonable to expect. And obviously, other than just saying that's wrong, like is there anything else you can say?
Yeah, the question is when people, I guess you're saying Christians in general, right? Like other Christians argue that divorce is okay.
Yeah, pretty much. I think I don't even know there's anything else in our camp in terms of like defending the complete indissolubility of marriage.
Yeah, there's pretty much not, right?
Okay.
Like Catholics are pretty much on their own. Well, yeah, other than the words of Scripture, right? Like which are pretty clear. So my in-laws are Protestant, and my wife's dad's wife, it's his third wife, one time took a like a little bite at Allison about the Catholic Church, and and divorce, right? And the problem is that, you know, she wanted what she wanted, right? And you're going to find justification for it, right? And you know, when you don't have other people around you doing, like, telling you what not to do, like, this is why it's so important. Again, going back to what I said about like the Catholic marriage, of like, when you have questions, where do you go? Like, if everyone's doing it, and that's ultimately, it's a really hard conversation to have with someone because they're not really open to it anyway, right? They're just looking for justification to do what they want to do. And I don't know that you can argue them back other than to just say, like, because scripture is so clear, right? Like, you know, other than just kind of saying, hey, like, if that's really a sign of Christ in the church, then you're saying that, you know, Christ is either like moving to a different church. And see, but you see already, right? Like, if you have this vision of church as being these separate things, right? It's a package deal.
Well, it's funny because one of the people I talked to about this has said, you know, they said that that was a cultural thing, and of course, obviously Christ was literally actually acting countercultural to it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he's flipping the culture over, right? Like, to say it's a cultural thing is, again, like falsifying what it's actually saying. All right, so, and then some of this too, which goes back to what Connor was saying earlier about apostolic exhortation.
I have a question.
Yes.
You say like Christ brings two people together for marriage. Would you say arranged marriage is a result of sin, or do you think there's divine influence in that?
So I don't necessarily think like that's a cultural, like, arranged marriage is kind of a cultural thing. One of the beautiful things that arises from that, right, is the fact that love is an act of the will, right? It's not an act of attraction. It's not an act of, so it shows that a person can fully choose to give themselves to another person, as a total act of freedom and a total act of love, without, you know, maybe even, you know, spending more than a few minutes with them. Now, like, I think what you're really getting at is the question of, like, does God have one person we're supposed to marry, which is sort of the question hidden underneath your question about, like, does God providentially bring them together? The answer to that question is yes, because they providentially ended up together. It's something that is objectively good, right? The question as to whether, like, there's one person we're supposed to marry, I don't know. Like, I don't know how you would even begin to tackle that question.
I didn't mean to ask that, but that's where
No, but it's the next logical question, right? Like, I know you didn't ask that question, but it was the next logical question from that. And I don't know that there's necessarily an answer, although, you know, I would have a hard time believing, like, from my own situation, that there was someone else I was supposed to marry.
I mean, ultimately, I mean, you can certainly say that God doesn't have a plan B, and so the person you're with is who you were for all time. God knew you were going to be with. I guess, but I don't even know how you could prove or disprove that there could be some other.
Yeah, and there's just too many, like, I don't know, just too many, like, issues of complementarity with a specific person, like in a marriage, that work out, that you're just like, okay, there's no way that, like, at the beginning of time, God didn't say this person and this person belong together.
You know, you might not follow his plan. There could be someone that your marriage could, like, work with, but that doesn't mean there's not, like, the plan that he set out for you.
Yeah, there is that, right?
And
And
look at, like, Mary and Joseph, right? Like, I'm not going to go around saying, like, maybe they weren't meant to marry each other. Like, they very much were. So I think using that, like, one example, there very least could be argument for. There's definitely cases where, like, that was cool.
yeah.
I've heard some different things, like one of the arguments against, like, it's only one person is that, like, the way we're made. Yeah, like, it takes a lot for that complementarity, but a lot of it is effort too. And so it's not like you can just marry anyone, but there are probably a handful of people, like, throughout the world where if you met and you fell in love and you, like, really worked at it, it could be a marriage. But then, like, there are, again, too many cases where you look at it, it's like, okay, that, like, is too perfect. And then that gets into the, like, does God function under both? If so,
Well, yeah, he would. Like, so, I mean, in the end, it's a question of providence, right? And, you know, providence always chooses what's best. So, yeah. All right. So what I want to talk a little bit about now about divorce, because it tends to be that we have the attitude that divorce is okay as long as there's no remarriage, right? And I want us to kind of move away from that, right? So there are situations, I mean, the church will say there are some situations in which living together becomes practically impossible for a variety of reasons. Such cases, the church permits the physical separation of the couple and their living apart. The spouses do not cease to be husband and wife before God, and so are not free to contract a new union. In this difficult situation, the best solution would be, if possible, reconciliation. Christian community is called to help these persons live out their situation in a Christian manner and in fidelity to their marriage bond, which remains indissoluble. All right, so regardless of what happens, divorce is just a civil reality, right? Some kind of legal arrangement of how you're going to live apart. The marriage bond can't ever be broken. It's forever, or till death do us part, right? And so the church has never taught that the person could be remarried, even if they're in a situation that is, you know, really hard. All right, I'll just leave it at that. And so St. Paul says there's basically two options: reconciliation or remain single. But so what about the exception? All right. So in Matthew, so that at the bottom there is the from St. Paul, the two options. In Matthew's gospel, there seems to be an exception. And so what about the exception? What is this? Unless the marriage is unlawful or for unchastity. Sorry, I don't know why that's all coming up now. Okay, so what is there an exception? Okay, so what is the Pauline privilege, Connor?
There's the Pauline privilege. Well, there's two. There's the Petrine privilege, which you already talked about, just the Pope can solve the Sacramental. There's Pauline privilege, which is, I think, is if both are unbaptized, one of them gets baptized, and the other one is making it difficult for them to live as a danger to their faith, they are allowed to separate, and their marriage is actually dissolved at that point.
Okay, no, that is the Pauline privilege, I think is what's called, right? But so that, what is the idea then? It's, so first of all, anytime there's an exception like that, there means there's a law, right? Like the exception proves the rule, right? And so what we have to begin to do is to see divorce as the evil and not just remarriage, right? See, we've kind of moved it back like a whole step by just saying, okay, well, if you have to divorce, you just can't get remarried, right? Divorce in and of itself is evil. And there's nobody better at explaining this than G.K. Chesterton. So he has an entire book called The Superstition of Divorce. All right. And so I'm going to read this, and then I want to talk about a little bit about the effects of divorce and why we should see it as evil. While free love seems to me a heresy, divorce does really seem to me a superstition. It is not only more of a superstition than free love, but much more of a superstition than strict sacramental marriage, and this point can hardly be made too plain. It is the partisans of divorce, not the defenders of marriage, who attach a stiff and senseless sanctity to a mere ceremony apart from the meaning of the ceremony. Okay, so he's saying if somebody can break a vow, that you could it's superstitious to think you could break a vow. All right, that's what he's saying. It is our opponents and not we who hope to be saved by the letter of the ritual instead of the spirit of reality. It is they who hold that vow or violation, loyalty or disloyalty, can be disposed of by a mysterious and magic rite, performed first in a law court and then in a church or a registry office. All right. So what is he sort of getting at with divorce. So the first question is, and this actually is a question I ask a lot of people when they talk about this. Why do you think that somebody made a vow, broke it, and they're going to keep it with you this time? Right? That's part of the superstition, right? Like this person pledged to give their life to the other person. They broke the vow. Why do you think you will be different? Right? And that is a valid question. And that's what Chesterton is sort of getting at, is the fact that it immediately just feeds into that suspicion between the man and the woman, right? Because you can never really trust someone who you know has broken a vow. How do you trust someone who you know has broken a vow? A vow they, in a certain sense, in a Christian marriage, have made before God. So there will always be this sort of suspicion, and to think that it just that you could, just dissolve it by going to the courthouse, is the superstitious part, right? That if somehow the vow is no longer exists, you never made the vow because you did that. But because, and this is the bigger issue, because a child, like, where's the natural place that a child's brought into the world? Marriage, right? What does it say to a child if that marriage is no longer a marriage? A lot. Like, what does it say about the child themselves? I mean, let's tick off the little, and we can get at the heart of a lot of the psychological distress of our culture just by listing these things. Right. First question: were you made by love? Doesn't seem like it, right? Like, first and fundamental, right? Why were you made? Because God loves. Right? Why were you made? I don't know. Accidental, right? Like, these two people just happened to like each other for a little while, and now they no longer did, right? So, all right, stability, right? How stable are children, regardless of their relationship with their parents, when their parents love each other? Really stable, right? Really stable. And so, and I think I've shared this before, like, my kids all know my wife comes first, right? They all know that because they're stable, because our love is unshakable, right? And so that is a rock in their life, regardless of the relation. Now, I'm not saying that you just love but usually the mistake is, especially when people first have kids, they're like, you ask them, we do like marriage prep with couples, and one of the questions on the thing is always like, okay, who comes first, your children or your spouse? And they always say children, right? And they're like, nope, wrong answer, right? Wrong answer, right? They're the fruit of love, right? And all of their stability is with their parents, all right? What else are they taught? Well, that men and women aren't complementary, but competitive, right? So where does a child learn how the opposite sexes are supposed to interact with each other? Watching their parents, right? So not surprisingly, you can create a whole culture with a culture of divorce. You can create a whole culture of people who can't get along with people of the opposite sex, right? In which their relationship is primarily and fundamentally competitive, right? Thus, the sort of Marxist regime in which males are the oppressor, women are the oppressed. All right, that's why when there's a whole scale divorce, that's what happens, right? And that's why one of Marx's tricks is to allow no fault divorce. All right. What else? How about the fragmentation of identity? Right? I have my stuff over here at mom's. I have my stuff over here at dad's. And I don't really have a stable place in which I can be me, and I have an identity. All right. And so when you begin to have a whole culture like that, that's why we see people with as many psychological problems as there are. It's because of divorce. All right. The good news, though, like all things, right, especially if you've come from a divorce situation, is marriage heals that. Right? Marriage heals that, even that too. Right? So God will heal you through your own marriage. Right? Will give you an identity. Will show you, okay, that's not like, God will father you and show you how it is. All right. And that's the issue, like why we can't just sit by while marriage is redefined, change into something else, and no fault divorce exists, right? We can't be silent on that because it actually has a profound effect on people and then a profound effect on society as a whole, right? Does that make sense? Yes.
Taking kind of a larger picture on what you said, when did society forget that the family consists of, I don't mean it's just in a sense of, obviously, legally it was only within my lifetime that we forgot that marriage was between a man and woman, but I mean more in the sense of, because I mean, there was a case in California where 3 men now are like the fathers on a child's birth certificate or something like that. I mean, and not only is it, you're not likely to say, okay, that's wrong on like, there's 3 men or data, but in the sense of like society doesn't seem to think it's important that you have 1 mom and 1 dad, just from a child. I mean, obviously that can't be talked about because if it is, and suddenly homosexual couples are, you can't have children anymore. But how did we get here? Like what?
Yeah, so I think the start of it is no fault divorce, right? In the 1960s, the governor of California was the first to institute no fault divorce, Ronald Reagan. And I think from there, like that, when think about that for a second, what no fault divorce actually means, right? That just means if I'm tired of you, that's it. Like, now divorce is bad, but no fault divorce just says you are expendable and only here for me, right? And what that ended up doing then is creating all these broken situations where everyone's scrambling just to see what the best they could do, right? Like the stupidity of kids are resilient, right? Like kids are the least resilient. Obviously, they're kids, right? So I think it's that, and then I think the second part of it is contraception. Right? Contraception essentially says that marriage wasn't made. The end of marriage isn't family, right? So and when you do that, then you lose the definition of family, right? A family is just adults and kids living together. And so I think it's those 2 things. I think it's divorce, breaking up, because marriage essentially, right, is the foundation of the family, right? So a husband and a wife, at least the way the church looks at it, they're not a family. A husband and a wife with a child are a family, which is why the church always says the family, right? Like capital F, family. So I think that's probably where it started, and then it just keeps rolling from there. All right, so declaration of nullity, as opposed to an annulment. The words kind of matter a little bit here. An annulment essentially makes you think that some reality has been canceled, whereas a declaration of nullity says that thing never happened. All right, and that's why the importance of sort of the language, right? Because when people call it an annulment, they basically see it as like this Catholic divorce, right? Well, you just got to get a Catholic divorce. Declaration of nullity says, okay, there was an impediment there at the moment that they exchange vows that didn't, so that the reality of marriage never actually occurred, right? Whereas if you start using terms like annulment, it makes it seem like, well, they were married, but now they're not, right? And so the church does have the power and the right to determine when a valid marriage has occurred. So the church's official declaration of an apparently valid marriage is actually null and void because of an invalidating impediment, lack of, such as previous marriage, lack of due consent, or a defect of required form. This is all at the time this has to be at the time that vows are exchanged, right? So something that actually caused the person not to be able to actually contract the marriage, okay? Like it's not something afterwards, like, oh, I had no idea that he was such a jerk, right? Like none of those things work, okay? All right, last sort of section. Yes, Connor.
What does like required knowledge mean? Because a lot, I don't know the numbers on how many people get receive declarations of nullity. But it's maybe in our culture, like it really is common that people don't know what they're doing. But Like, I guess how much do you have to not? Because I mean, because most of the time you think of examples is okay, someone was drunk, and they said, okay, I was like, or the kid was too young, like we said, okay, they're too young, they can't understand what they're doing, or they're somehow mentally handicapped, they couldn't understand what they're doing.
Yeah, that one would be really difficult to prove, right? And so the church, at least when it's functioning really well, always errs on the side of them being married. So there would have to be some, like, if it's questionable, they would say they were married, rather than say, oh, they weren't married. So there has to be definitive proof. At least that's the way it's like supposed to operate. Cardinal Burke, when he was head of I forget what the curie is, but he was reforming the Declaration of Nullity, right? And he was trying to get it to make it way harder, speed up the process, but make it way harder, because the church is not infallible when they declare this, right? The people could actually be married. The church is rendering a judgment, and it doesn't necessarily. So, and he's very clear about. Cardinal Burke was like, look, we have to spend the time and invest in this because souls could be lost if we're wrong, right? Because the church could put someone in an objective state of sin, right? Even maybe subjectively they're not guilty, but nevertheless, and so there should be a really stringent process. You could certainly speed it up, because it's probably a painful process, but nevertheless, they need to do a really good job because the burden of proof is really on to prove that a marriage didn't occur. So they're already going into assuming that it occurred and fix from there. Yes, Ryan.
One last thing related to that. How would you respond to someone who were like, okay, so you're divorced and like reconciliation isn't gonna happen. So kind of their response to what? So they're supposed to just live single forever? Like, how do you, objectively, yes, that's what they're saying. How do you phrase that a little nicer? Such that people are going to be more receptive?
Yeah, I think it's like, so the question is how do you help people adjust to the reality that if reconciliation is impossible, that they're going to have to live their life single. I think the definition of pastoral is to help people, like, give them the reality and then help them live their lives around it, right? So it would really depend on the person. But again, it's first, a person's way more likely to reconcile if they realize they have no other option. That would be the first thing, right? Like, just on a human level, right? But the second, again, is invite people to embrace the cross, right? Like, that's a cross. That's a hard cross to live the rest of your life by yourself, right? But it's also sanctifying, right? Like, this is, again, creating a whole generation of Catholics who love the cross. We're willing to embrace the cross, right? And that's ultimately, like, the best you can do. You can invite them to embrace the cross. You can do it in all kinds of ways. You can help them in all kinds of ways. But in the end, like, that's what has to happen. Because, I mean, every marriage, whether they reconcile or not, they're still going to have to embrace the cross. Every marriage has crosses in it, no matter how great it is, right? And so their cross, that's their cross. And the goal is to help them carry it in some way. But the option of throwing it off is that's not an option. All right, last section on openness to fertility. All right, so Humanae Vitae, this particular doctrine, often expanded by the magisterium of the church, is based on the inseparable connection by God, which man of his own initiative may not break, between the unitive significance and the procreative significance, which are both inherent to the marital act. The reason is that the fundamental nature of the marriage act, while uniting husband and wife in the closest intimacy, also renders them capable of generating a new life. And this is as a result of laws written into the actual nature of man and woman. And if each of these essential qualities, the unitive and procreative, is preserved, the use of marriage fully retains a sense of true mutual love and its ordination to the supreme responsibility of parenthood to which man is called. Okay, so what does it mean to be open to life? What is openness to fertility? What is the couple pledging? Okay, and this pertains specifically to the marital act. Okay, So maybe we can come at it from the other way. So a person says, okay, the purpose of the marital act is for us to unite. So we can even put away the person who argues that it's just mutual pleasure. All right. Why does it also have to be open to life?
By its very nature, by its very nature, it has to be open. By its very nature, it is ordered towards life, and which is ordered to do that, it violates makes the act defective in some way. But also, and because of that, you could argue that it's not really unitive if it's not open life, and you can't break one part without breaking the other part.
Okay, so those two things are what Connor's saying is that the two things, the procreative meaning of it and the unitive meaning are one and the same thing. All right, they're two sides of the same coin. All right, and so in a certain sense, there's no to say you want to unite with another person. So what are we saying? Like, okay, let's back up. The act itself, the marital act, what does it mean? What is its meaning? What is it? What is its telos? What is it for? What is it?
It's telling the person, yeah, I'm giving you everything. So like, yes, my heart, yes, my body, but also like my bank account and my future and everything else. And part of giving them your future and your body includes giving them your entire body, which includes your fertility.
Yeah. So fertility is part of the person, right? So the total gift of self and the total reception of the other person, which is what marriage is, right? No matter what our definition from the beginning was, right? It always was tending towards the communion of their persons. So the full gift of self, right? Everything, every aspect of yourself, right? And the sign of that thing, of that gift, of that total gift of self is the marital embrace. All right. But it's not, again, not a sign, but also brings about the reality of it, right? So it's a sacrament in the small sense, right? Small s sense. All right. So how do you argue though with someone that when they say their acts really are unitive, even though they're not procreative? Okay. And that's what I want to end with. So male and female are complete individuals with respect to every function. Okay. Nutrition, sensation, locomotion. I am my own. All right. With respect to reproduction, they are only potential parts of a mated pair, which is the complete organism capable of reproducing sexually. Even if the mated pair is sterile, intercourse, provided it is the reproductive behavior characteristic of the species, makes the copulating male and female one organism. All right, so what is he saying? All right. And what is it exactly on? So we're talking about a full gift of self, a full union between the couples, right? Body and soul. All right. So on the bodily level, what actually causes them to unite? They're united in the fact that they can reproduce, right? So if the act is not ordered towards reproduction, are they united on a bodily level? No, right? I mean, when you begin to then unpack this and understand the nuances of it, this is actually an effective way to argue against contraception, just so you know. Like I've had people who really thoughtful people begin to grasp why it's wrong, right? Because human beings, right, can do everything on their own except for reproducing, right? And so they have to be united to another human being in order to reproduce, right? And so you're not really united to the person on the body level unless that act is ordered towards that. Okay, what does it mean to say that the act is ordered towards that, though? Yeah, so it is capable of creating a life, right? Now, whether that actually happens is out of control of the couple, right? You can't force someone to be pregnant, right? So that's why every act, that's what the openness to life means, an openness to fertility. And that's why a couple that is infertile, either one, they still have a valid marriage and still can do nothing wrong in the marital embrace. right? Because the reason why they don't have a child is outside of their control, but their acts still have to be ordered towards that, right? So that's the point, right? Does that make sense? All right. All right, so questions, especially on that. It would be good if we could kind of unpack that.
So have you really, again, I think for most people that I've been talking to this about are really just kind of closed off. They don't really care. They just kind of, they've decided what side they're on and they will act in accordance with that. They don't really, I don't really think they're very open to it. But I feel like it's a difficult, I feel like it is a very difficult argument to make to say that a man, or even taking out cases where it's the guy and the girl unmarried or something like that. I think it is hard, in my experience, I find it hard to argue that the man and woman who are married